All right, in this next session, we're going to talk about some ACES differences and Gotchyas. We talked about this a little bit in the real world examples, but I just wanted to have a little more formal talk through of what's going on in ACES 1.2 versus ACES 1.3, at least relative to how the artist is going to interact with it. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of all the technical changes between OCIO and the ACES configs and everything else. So to start, basically, there's two buckets of ACES. There's ACES 1.3, which uses a config only, like it has no supporting files. It supports all the camera log formats using functions, versus ACES 1.2 and earlier, which are relying on SBI 1D LUT files for their camera profiles. And then it's doing the matrix math inside the configs. So the first thing, and this is a big one, viewer processes are a little bit different between 1.2 and 1.3. So in this case, I'm in 1.3, and you'll see that we just have a bevy of different options. They're also grouped a little different. So they're grouped by display type. So we have sRGB display, and then our Rec 1886-709 display, and so on and so forth. If you go into ACES 1.2, for example, and check out the viewer, you just have sRGB, Rec 709, each space kind of has its own thing. They're not clumped the way that they're clumped in 1.3. Which takes me to the next point. We have the addition of SDR and untone mapped. So what that means, if we were to look back at 1.2, this sRGB is actually a tone mapped sRGB. So this correlates to ACES 1.0 SDR video in 1.3. So if you're looking for analogs between the two, if you're using sRGB, that is what it is in 1.3. Untone mapped, which is my personal preference for most things, although realistically you should be looking at maybe a couple different of these viewer processes when you're checking your work. I prefer the untone mapped sRGB that doesn't put that highlight compression on top, which in ACES 1.2 there is no analog. I see a lot of people use Rec 709. The Rec 709 also has a little bit of tone mapping. It's just not as aggressive as the sRGB. But yes, there is no analog. And we actually, in the examples script, we talk about an sRGB hack for the viewer process in 1.2 so that you can see things in that untone mapped sRGB space like you would see in regular Nuke or in ACES 1.3 untone mapped. So that's kind of the first thing, is you have tone mapping in 1.2 on your processes, where in ACES 1.3 you have the option for both tone mapped and untone mapped. We talked briefly, so the config file in ACES 1.2 also requires a LUT folder, and that's using SBI 1D files. They're basically like a cube file. It's a matrix of values where input, if the input is this, then the output is this. Those can be pretty heavy. I think the current LUT stack, let's see, the current LUT stack is something like 4 gigs. No, that one's not. It's like 4, yeah, many megabytes of files to create all the LUTs for the ACES 1.2 config. Whereas the ACES 1.3 config, the entirety of the config is in the text file. So you have a 50-something kilobyte text file, and it handles all of the config. So from a sidecar standpoint, from a deployment standpoint, it's a lot easier to send a text file than having to send a LUT stack or send a link to the GitHub where people are downloading that config, or you're sharing a much larger config with a lot more files to manage. So that's a really nice thing with 1.3 versus 1.2 from a deployment standpoint on my end. The next thing, and this is really, people that are using those output spaces. And the way I think of output spaces, so if I go back into my 1.2, so if we have a color space node in 1.2, one of the categories, so you have your color spaces, ACES input, output, utility. Output is a category where I see a lot of people use output sRGB, output Rec 709. When they say output, they're talking about your display processes. So these are your display processes. These are the tone mapped profiles. So output sRGB is tone mapped. These are not the spaces you want to use for writing out QuickTimes or images, for example, JPEGs, for example. And to help kind of fix some of that, in 1.3, they removed the output column or the output category. So that is not part of color spaces anymore. And if you actually get into the weeds on it, there's now display transforms and color spaces instead of standard color spaces. So here we have display color spaces, and you actually access them a little bit differently. So you would access those via the OCIO display node. And this way you set your display type and you set the transform. So if you want sRGB tone mapped, you would use sRGB display ACES 1.0 SDR. And that's how you would access those the things that were previously in the output category. That's a big one in terms of a move that most people should be aware of. And the same controls also live on the right node. So you can set color space or display as the type. And then from there, you can pick those, if you do want tone mapping for one reason or another, or you want to bake your tone mapping into a QuickTime, you can do that in a right node using the transform type. But historically, that's not something you want to bake in. So that's kind of the big one in terms of the 1.2 stuff. When we talked about our viewer processes, and the other nice thing, 1.3 has the latest camera spaces. So you're going to get the newer stuff. But on the flip side of that, 1.3 also has considerably less profiles accessible. So if you flip through here and you go to input, you'll see like ARRI, for example, they basically slim this down to just the one log C3 profile. You don't have the log C3 for all the different exposures that ARRI provides in their white paper, like you have in 1.2. If we look at ARRI's inputs in 1.2, you'll see that we have them for all the exposure indexes. That was done away with in 1.3. If you want them, you can add them back in. But as a default, those are now gone. And generally speaking, most of the time we're using 800 anyway. Either because cameras are shot that way or people just use that as a default. But they've also added log C4, which we don't have access to in the older inputs. We have Blackmagic, Canon, Panasonic, Red, and Sony. And again, all of these have been slimmed down. So Red, there's really only two options. If you look back at 1.2, input for Red, we have a myriad of options. And it's possible that you might need some of these, and so in that case, you would backport them from a 1.2 config to a 1.3 config. You might need to include a 1D LUT file, or you would use the white paper and the hooks in 1.3 to actually generate those natively inside the config. So yeah, that's a thing you got to watch out for, is there are fewer profiles immediately accessible in 1.3. The other thing relative to them moving things around, here are some common profiles and the matrix of where they port relative to where you're at. So if you're using Nuke default, traditionally just Rec 709 is the only option. That would port to utility Rec 709 in 1.2. A lot of people use output Rec 709, which I personally believe is incorrect because it is a tone mapped process and this is not. And then in 1.3, that moved again to utility ITU camera Rec 709. Similar for sRGB, we have sRGB in Nuke that would map to utility sRGB texture, which also is the same in 1.3. For linear in Nuke, In 1.3, if you're playing in kind of an unmanaged space, you would use utility linear sRGB, and that would feel about the same, but most camera IDTs have a linear variant in their input folder. So you just want to use the proper linear for what you're doing. And ACES CG and ACES 2065 are also linear, but they have different gamuts. So linear doesn't necessarily map directly, but if you were using linear sRGB as an analog, in 1.2 it's linear sRGB or linear Rec 709, and in 1.3 they combined them, so it's utility linear Rec 709 parentheses sRGB. A fun one, and we've had to deal with this before, is Cineon, which we still receive film scans in Cineon color space. Doesn't have an analog in 1.2 or 1.3, which is kind of fun. Red log film uses the same curve. So if you're in 1.2, you can do a little hack to get around that and use the red log film profiles to achieve that Cineon transfer function. But red log film doesn't exist in 1.3. So there's a couple different ways you can approach Cineon. I have a little quick Cineon hack thing here. So say we have some source imagery and we're just looking at tone. We're looking at it tone mapped. You can use a color space node. That still exists no matter what ACES flavor you're in, and it has Cineon as a transfer space. If you're trying to do it in OCIO, if you're in 1.2, you can actually use input red. And if you use curve only applies the transfer function. It doesn't do any gamut transforms. So you can use curve red log film. And then for the output, you would actually use ACES 2065, because remember, you're in ACES 2065 under the hood. When it does transforms, it's transforming to and from 2065. And then it converts to your working space from there. So you would use ACES 2065, and that way you're doing no gamut transform, you're only doing a transfer function. And if we look at our diff key, you can see that we are 0 across the board. Those two yield the exact same thing. You can also use a log to lin tool. Another way is the same method, and you can use this for other images too. If you get something that is linear camera native gamut or log camera native gamut and you need to just do a transfer function, you can do this with any format, but you can basically set the input to red log film red color, and you would set the output to red linear red color. So that way you're doing a transfer relative to the gamut, but it's same. So functionally you're only doing a gamut transfer function. And then yes, log to lin. The other way, and you can actually see all this if you look at the OCIO code for those red and red log film color spaces. So you can see input here. We're using Cineon log to linear, the SPI1D file, and it's doing a matrix transform. If you look at the red curve, red log film, you can see that we're only doing a Cineon to linear transfer function. And similarly, you can see that ACES 65 has no color transforms at all. Versus like linear sRGB, which is where a lot of people, they're like, oh, I want it to be linear sRGB instead. They'll transform here, but that's not actually the output space you want typically. So just some quick code under the hood. And then if you're in, say, 1.3 and you don't have access to red log film, you can actually write your own color spaces. So in this case, I made up 2 Cineon spaces, and I used the log affine transform, and I was able to generate the Cineon curve, just the curve by itself, which if I want to follow their naming system. I would name this input curve Cineon. And then I built a second one that basically puts us into Cineon sRGB space, Rec 709 space, gamut. Which is generally, like the scans we've seen, they usually feel better that way. Because Cineon's technically gamutless. So it's just a transfer function. There is no gamut associated with it, but in a fully managed gamut system, you need to be able to assign it a gamut so that it moves correctly when you start doing other things. But yeah, so in this case, we're doing a transform, a matrix transform, and then we are doing our log affine transform. And these are backwards relative to what you've seen in the comps, because we are going from scene reference. You can go to scene reference or from scene reference, and it changes the order in which those are applied. But yeah, so quick little Cineon hack relative to using Cineon across the different versions of color management. So yeah, that covers the really big things. There's a lot under the hood that changed between like OCIO 2 and OCIO 1, and if you're into that, I highly recommend hitting up ACES Central and checking out the GitHub repos. There's a lot of information out there on the specific differences and ways to operate with those different management systems.